My name is Stanley Chiu. I was born and raised in and around Chinatown in Chicago, and now I live in League City, Texas, a suburb of Houston. My racism starts with my mother. She was born in China and migrated to America when she was 30. People born in China are generally very racist. Their opinions of other races are often caricatures of the worst stereotypes. I spent 7 years in China, and because I had Chinese blood, Chinese people were very open to me about their racism. My mom has views that are typical for a mainland Chinese person. My mom viewed blacks as violent, poor, and generally inferior to Chinese people. She thought that Hispanics are poor, and she kind of envied or tolerated whites because she knew that they were the man. She calls black people black monsters and white people white monsters. She thinks recent Chinese immigrants are rude. Whenever she sees someone driving around Chinatown worse than her, she assumes that they are recent Chinese immigrants. So no one is safe from her racism. She tried to indoctrinate those views into my brother and I at a very young age. She's very explicit with her racism. My grandparents also looked after us when we were young, and though they didn't talk about race much, I've never heard them object when someone in the family expressed racist views similar to my mom. I don't remember much of my life before the age of 6 or 7, but almost all of the memories that I had from that age were traumatic. I have 2 memories from kindergarten. The first was shortly after beginning kindergarten, and it was a warm, sunny day. We were lined up outside school, waiting to be let in, and this big black kid from 2nd or 3rd grade picks a fight with me. And I didn't know him. I didn't know hardly anyone at school. I mean, there were a couple kids who, went to that school for my preschool, but didn't really know them. And the next thing I remember, I'm in pain. I'm on the ground and I'm crying, and I'm terrified of black boys. My second memory of kindergarten is being made fun of and socially isolated by the other kids in my class because I think it was due to me not speaking English as well as them and not fitting in. Even though I was born in Chicago, my mother and grandparents, who were my primary caregivers, only spoke Cantonese Chinese. Even today, my mom speaks very limited English. She knows enough to get by, and she can communicate, talk to the customer service people about why she needs to return an item that she bought way better than I can. So whenever she does that, I just stand back, cross my arms, and give the idea that I'm with her, but I don't have any comments. She can also defend herself against her former boss at the suit factory. So the things that she has to get done, she has the English for. For everything else, my brother and I have translated. I went to 2 years of preschool at the Chinese American Service League. But it was a preschool at the time where all of the students, all the other kids, came from Chinese-speaking families, and all of the teachers at the time all the teachers could speak Chinese. And so I didn't have to learn English as well as a kid who came from a primarily English-speaking preschool. My English caught up with the other kids by the 1st or 2nd grade, but I remember kids in my class making fun of me for being Chinese. I remember white kids in my neighborhood taunting me with karate chops and Bruce Lee calls. And when that didn't elicit the reaction that they wanted, they started to mock me with what they thought was Chinese. I was miserable in kindergarten, and I felt it was because I was Chinese. And for the rest of my childhood, I tried to get away from being Chinese. The other major formative experience that shaped my views on race is that even though I didn't want much to do with being Chinese, almost all of my friends from elementary school to high school were Asian Americans and primarily Chinese Americans. And this is pretty typical in America. 65% Black Americans have only Black friends. 46% of Hispanic Americans have only Hispanic friends. It seems like kids from a very young age learned that you should stick with people of your own race. In my school, Black kids mostly hung out with Black kids and whites with whites, and etc. This meant that I didn't have many experiences to push back against the stereotypes that I developed through my mom and my early childhood experiences. I mean, luckily I had a few non-Asian friends outside of school, so I wasn't completely screwed up. But, you know, these formative experiences left long-lasting subconscious biases. You know, I was terrified of Black boys. I didn't like being Chinese, didn't like Chinese people, and I felt more comfortable with Asians. I now live in League City, a suburb that is 80% white. I'm not sure that I've experienced overt racism here. There have been a couple instances where older white men have stared at me very strangely. But people are really weird, so I can't say that that was due to my race. Maybe I was just the most attractive man that they had ever seen in their life. How I feel racism here is that my family seems to get ignored by people more often than white people. When I take my daughter to swim meets, she gets ignored by the other kids when they socialize with each other, and they kind of leave her out more often than not, and we have to tell her, you know, to socialize with them, to make the effort, make the first effort. And then when we're at small stores, my family doesn't seem to get recognized by the staff as much as other people do. But most of the time I don't mind too much because I'm introverted and I don't feel very comfortable talking to strangers. But sometimes I wouldn't mind a hi. This past weekend, I organized a vigil for George Floyd at my subdivision, and it made me realize a new type of racism that I had not experienced before. The goal of the vigil was to have a community healing event where we remembered and reflected on George Floyd and other victims of violence, shared stories of racism, and to really get to know our neighbors. I arrived at this format because I thought it was the least controversial way that we could have the event while still talking meaningfully about race. Immediately after I posted the event on Nextdoor, I got a lot of pushback. 90% of the comments and reactions to the event on the Nextdoor website were negative. And you know, I made the event only viewable to the neighbors in my subdivision. And so, you know, these negative feedback were, you know, potentially coming from people who lived down the street, you know, that I would see on the walking trail the next day. And so, yeah, they were, you know, serious feedback. They were feedback from people, like my real neighbors. You know. Many felt that the event would lead to the violence that they saw in other cities. Some people questioned why we would want to share stories of racism. And some felt that talking about race would turn neighbor against neighbor. Some people said that I would be held personally liable for any damages or harm that resulted from the event. A very vocal minority of neighbors felt so threatened by the event that they called the police and the HOA to try to get the event shut down. They also called the police to complain about the little flyers that I and a couple second graders distributed door to door to people's doormats to advertise the event. The police told me that it was unlawful to distribute the flyers door to door, to distribute any kind of flyers. But of course, I had already cleared the vigil with the HOA and the police, and I had skimmed through the League City Municipal Code ahead of time so that I knew what I could and could not do with the event. The Municipal Code wasn't that long, by the way. It took about an hour to skim through. After being ordered by the police to stop distributing the flyers, I emailed the city attorney who was responsible for interpreting the code, and I pointed out that the municipal code appeared not to allow the distribution of commercial flyers, but it didn't say anything about the distribution of non-commercial flyers, which my event was. Right? We weren't trying to make any money from the event. His office emailed me back the next day to say that what I was doing was not a code violation. So I forwarded this email to the local police and asked them to update their awareness training. So lovers of liberty in League City, you can thank me for expanding your First Amendment rights. I invited a local pastor to deliver a sermon and prayer at the vigil. After I saw their church give a great service about racism and the kingdom of God the Sunday before. The pastor gave a great analogy of being on your front porch and watching one of your neighbors get beat up. And you just watch and you don't do anything, and you go back home. And he said that that's what's happening with racism most of the time. And it was inconsistent with God's teaching. He said that, we had to do something. We had to confront racism. The lead pastor was not available that night, so he put me in touch with one of the other pastors at the church, and I talked to him, and he thought it sounded like a great event, and he agreed to come. I then updated the posting next door with the pastor's name, and within an hour of that, he had emailed back to say that, some other personal thing had come up, and he could no longer come. I tried to find another pastor that could come, and I looked through the Sunday services of all the churches in my area over the last 2 weeks, and I found that only 10% of them meaningfully addressed racism or the protests that resulted in the past 2 weeks. At the time of this recording, in early to mid-June 2020, we're having one of the largest social upheavals in the United States. And it's created one of the best opportunities to talk about race. And 90% of the churches in my area are not doing it because they're afraid that their church goers don't want them to talk about it. And they're afraid that their church attendance will go down and that their donations will go down. So why do I think opposing talking about racism or remaining silent on racism is supporting racism? It's because we live in a racist society where race is a factor in almost every facet. Right? In almost every metric of well-being, black and brown people are worse off than whites. Look at income, job opportunities, life expectancy, maternal mortality, the use of force. Black and brown people aren't being valued at the same as whites. 76% of Americans are white, and we're not going to end racism if the majority of those white Americans refuse to acknowledge racism or don't do anything to oppose it. If you don't do anything, you are supporting the status quo. And right now, the status quo is deeply entrenched racism. So as a kid, I saw and experienced a lot of explicit racism in a very multicultural city. And now, when I live in a mostly white community, I experience racism through being ignored most of the time, but then attacked whenever I ever so gently try to be anti-racist. The last part of my personal story, and I think the most important part, is how do I deal with my own racism? First, I recognize the subconscious racist feelings that I developed as a child will probably never go away. I recognize that when I see a black man that is a stranger to me, that I might be subconsciously thinking to create some more space between myself and that person than otherwise. And so I make an effort to try to look through that person's skin and treat him fairly, treat him just as I would treat anyone else. I still have conflicted feelings about being Chinese. Whenever I see Team China at an international event, I want them to lose. And I'm going to get a lot of hate from mainland Chinese for saying that. Just watch the comments, they're going to say that I'm a race traitor. But I recognize that I was wrong when I was in college. And when I changed my majors, I focused on learning Chinese language and history and politics. And then I spent the next 6 to 7 years in China, working to make China be a better country in the world. And finally, I'm not so sure there's a problem with me feeling initially more comfortable around Asian American strangers than there are other people. When I get to know non-Asian Americans, I feel just as comfortable around them as anyone else. But this is probably a typical feeling. But let me know what you think of this. So that's my story. I'm tagging Monica Metzger, Jonathan Braque, and Jaime Garcia. I know each of you have a unique story and are much more well-spoken and telegenic than I am. So I'm really looking forward to hearing them.